The rise of artillery and the revival of infantry coincided with destructive religious wars that racked Europe, especially Central Europe, from the early and mid 1600s. The greatest of these was the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, which initially pitted Protestant Germans against Catholic Germans. Gradually, other parts of Europe were pulled in as well, especially Sweden, which was then a very important power, and France. Emblematic of its horrors was the sack of Magdeburg in 1631. This German city went over to the Protestants, only to be besieged and eventually captured by Catholic forces. And at least 20,000 civilians died when the Catholic forces came in and looted, pillaged, killed, assaulted, and ravaged the population. In all of the war, over 300,000 people were killed in battle, but millions of civilians died of malnutrition and disease. Wandering, undisciplined troops robbed, burned, and looted almost at will. Most authorities, most historians, most demographers, believe that the population of Central Europe dropped from about 21 million to 13.5 million between 1618 and 1648. Another problem, there we go. Another problem of the 30 Years' War that would continue for decades afterward was this. Soldiers might be disciplined on the battlefield, but to pay large army, but to maintain large armies in the field regularly outstripped the ability of the monarchs to pay for them. Soldiers therefore supplemented their pay through chronic looting, generally accompanied by assault and rape. This phenomenon, Professor John Lynn has dubbed the, quote, tax of violence. It indicates, among other things, that monarchies had not yet acquired the financial and bureaucratic ability to sustain the larger armies that they had created. Moreover, many of these armies were composed partly or completely of mercenaries, soldiers who fought for pay and whose loyalty could be counted upon only if they received money. If the money ran out, they could and did leave. Pas d'argent, pas de Suisse, no money, no Swiss, was a common expression of the time. The 30 Years' War finally ended in 1648, yielding what is known as the Westphalian Settlement, or the Peace of Westphalia, so named because the most important of several treaties was the Treaty of Westphalia. The treaty ended the religious wars that had plagued Europe for over a century by establishing several principles and international norms. First, the Westphalian settlement resolved the issues of the 30 Years' War, thereby ending it, and created the basic international order that has endured down to this day. One of the key principles that emerged from it was that the official religion of any given state would be that of the ruler. Okay. And there's a fancy Latin expression for this. I'll try to say, "Quis regio, ius regio," and that means whose realm, whose religion. So that was the rule. So that the understanding now was, hey, if France is Catholic, you can't have a war with France to try to change it into something Protestant. But what was also understood was that in most cases, people who were Protestant within France could privately practice their faith without much in the way of hindrance. Okay. The settlement also did much to clarify the boundaries of kingdoms and principalities and promoted the concept of absolute sovereignty, which is to say, no interference in the internal affairs of other kingdoms. Wars continued, but they were now fought for reasons of state, raison d'etat, or national interest. And these rational bases for conflict enabled many of them to be recognized and deflected diplomatically. In other words, since there was a rational reason for a potential war, you could see it coming and you could sort of negotiate your way out of it rather than have to fight it. Okay. The key principle involved with this Westphalian settlement in terms of wars being fought for reasons of state was that these wars were typically fought to maintain a balance of power. And maintaining a balance of power in Europe became a governing principle. And this was done through shifting alliances, all based on rational self-interest. Wars continued, but the limited aims of the reasons for war meant that the conduct of war was also limited. This map shows what Europe looked like after the Peace of Westphalia. And you can see that in many respects, it begins to resemble Europe as we know it today. Perhaps one of the main things that doesn't look like Europe as it is today, Western Europe, is the Holy Roman Empire, like Plunk in in Central Europe. This no longer exists, and it was a group of German-speaking principalities that were not united, and were sort of only loosely affiliated. But let's take a look over at France, because France was first among equals in Europe. And this Kingdom of France rose to preeminence under Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, who ruled France from the time he was 5 years old until his death at age 76. These nearly identical portraits depict him both as a king at left and as a warrior at right. France would remain the most powerful country in Europe until 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And many wars occurred as a result of France's bid to enhance its power by other kingdoms to try and contain France's power. These wars involved a pattern of military alliances that shifted over time, depending upon the perceived national interests of the various great powers. Emblematic of the splendor of Louis XIV was the Great Palace of Versailles, about 20 miles southwest of Paris. It was originally a hunting lodge, but Louis XIV ordered its conversion into a palace, which took place between 1661 and 1681. When it was sufficiently complete that the Sun King moved his entire court from Paris to Versailles and established his seat of government there. The palace continued its expansion until 1715. It was the supreme symbol of the power and prestige of the Sun King. It remained the residence of the French kings until the French Revolution, and during the 19th century was converted into a national museum, which it remains today. Well, by the way, we're going to encounter this palace two more times, once in 1789 during the French Revolution, and another time in 1871 with the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War. The Westphalian settlement reduced an atmosphere of permanent crisis and allowed reformers, military reformers, to at last address the perennial difficulty of a lack of complete control over military forces. The pioneer in this respect was Michel Letellier, who in 1643 became Secretary of State for Military Affairs to Louis XIV of France, and whose more famous son, the Marquis de Louvois, off to the right, perfected reforms that his father began. The basis of the reforms was a system of commissioners of war, who had authority to review muster rolls to prevent payment to soldiers who did not exist, and oversee matters of billeting and supply. The commissioners answered to Intendant de l'Armée, um, army intendants, who wielded royal powers formidable enough to control even very high ranking officers. Simultaneously, a brilliant minister of finance, Jean Baptiste Colbert, who initiated numerous measures to expand the French economy, thereby expanding the amount of wealth available for taxation, and also increasing the wealth generated by France's colonies. As a result of Colbert's reforms, France had the wealth necessary to recruit, pay, and equip its armies, and the administrative span of control necessary to keep those armies fully responsive to the wishes of the king and the king's ministers. In time, other kingdoms adopted similar reforms, and by 1700, professional armies had at last become the norm in Europe. To give you an idea, by the way, before we go on to look at Vauban here, to give you an idea of the army size during this period, look at a snapshot of France in 1678 would have been 220,000 infantry in the French army, 60,000 cavalry, and then 10,000 elite troops who worked directly under uh, the castle, the Maison du Roi. If you include militia, part-time soldiers, the strength was as high as 600,000 out of a total population of 20 million. Very expensive to maintain armed forces of this size. By 1691, 73% of all government revenue was spent on the French army, and another 16% was spent on the French Navy. Okay, let's get on to Vauban. In addition to Louvois and Colbert, Louis XIV was also ably assisted by his great military engineer, Sebastien Leprestre de Vauban. Vauban perfected the artillery fortress and ringed France's frontier citizens with them, while at the same time, by the way, dismantling many of the castles that survived in France's interior, because these were potential sources of strength, military strength for France's dukes and other nobility. Why give them even a shot at defying the monarch when you could knock down their castles and eliminate their military power outright? So Vauban constructed fortifications. He destroyed medieval fortifications, and by the way, he came up with a very scientific method of besieging the very kinds of fortifications that he constructed. So that he not only constructed artillery fortresses, but he also devised a systematic and nearly foolproof way to besiege them successfully. The technique was used, among other places, to defeat the British Army at the Siege of Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781, thereby ending the American War for Independence. From the mid 17th century onward, naval power also expanded as European powers developed the financial resources necessary to construct them. Naval power was measured by the possession of ships of the line, large vessels capable of carrying 80 to 100 cannon each. These were tremendously expensive to construct, and for most powers out of reach, either because of geography or by the lack of financial and material resources to keep up. As an island nation, England, after 1707, by the way, called Great Britain, England or Great Britain relied primarily on naval power, being an island nation. Now, you don't need to remember the following statistics, but I offer them to give you an idea of the sense of scale involved in the English/British Navy during this period. In 1688, the English monarch had at his disposal 173 warships of all types, ships of the line, frigates, sloops of war, and so forth, carrying a total of 6,970 cannon. By 1697, 323 warships with 9,912 cannon. By 1714, 247 warships with 10,603 cannon. Okay. By the end of the 1670s, France had a navy of 200 warships. That's pretty considerable in its own right, but could not keep pace with England. France was capable of building a large navy, yes, but depended extensively upon privateers, essentially state-sponsored pirates, which could successfully attack enemy merchant vessels and thereby save the monarchy much expense. So basically, you'd be a merchantman, a merchant captain. You'd have a merchant vessel. You could put cannon on it. You could get crews together who could fire the cannon. It wasn't rocket science. It wasn't that hard to do. And then you could get legal permission from your king to go off and prey upon enemy merchant shipping. And this was a way of augmenting naval power with actually putting the money into creating additional warships. Naval power enabled European kingdoms to acquire colonies around the world. And once acquired, European military superiority, fueled mainly by the military revolution, enabled them to maintain their grip for centuries. The governing economic principle was mercantilism, a system whereby colonies were expected to generate wealth only for the mother country and were often forbidden to trade with other countries. Many colonies resented this distant rule of the mother countries and the way in which they shackled local economic activity. This was a major reason that the English colonies in North America revolted and became the United States of America in 1775 to 1783. Other colonies, especially in Central and South America, gained their independence in the early 19th century. Others remained colonies until European power collapsed as a result of the devastation caused by the two world wars, leading up to the numerous wars of national liberation. These national liberations owed a great deal to the ideologies that would come out of the American Revolution to some extent, and to a greater degree, the French Revolutions, which we will explore next time.